So the next speaker of the session is also a designer coming from Oslo School of Architecture, and is mostly interested in topics that are similar to what Usman talked about. Is going to talk about how those technologies, those sensors, RFIDs, could help to help make visible things or phenomena that are invisible in our environment. So please welcome Timo Arnall.
Thank you very much. I was recently in an Internet of Things conference about the societal benefits of RFID, and the conference was delayed by an hour because they couldn't get the laptop to talk to the speakers and to talk to the projector. So I hope the technology is better here today. I thought that was quite ironic. Yeah, I'm Timo Arnall. I run a research project called Touch at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And we at Aarhus, we mainly do interaction in industrial design. So I'm very interested in things. I'm also very interested in the internet. I'm not primarily concerned about sustainability, although I'm interested in the longevity of objects. And I guess you could say that our work lives somewhere in the Internet of Things. I'm not particularly keen on the term Internet of Things. I think it has lots of different meanings to lots of different people. But I think Bruce and Usman have done quite a good job of sort of trying to wrap up what's been happening in that area over the last 5 or 6 years. So the first thing is that I find the internet really, really exciting. As I'm sure most people here, the internet is really good at the moment. There's lots of good stuff going on. It's a brilliant platform for doing a lot of stuff with. But I think there's also a potential downside of the internet and in its current incarnation. A few months ago, a researcher called Mark Smith spoke at the Microsoft Social Computing Symposium, and he talked about the idea of physical interaction, physical and digital interaction, and he said that most digital interaction takes place in another interaction order, in another space, not in the physical interaction order of co-presence. So we go to the internet, we go into screens. We sort of the internet and the use of the web is somehow separated, or it can be quite separated from our physical existence. And I think there's a current kind of trend or current push to try and change that. And I think the Internet of Things for me is something that is about trying to look at ways in which we can interact and ways in which we can participate in these environments without necessarily being in front of a screen. So for the last couple of years, we've been, in the Touch project, we've been looking at a technology called radio frequency identification. This technology is called one of the fundamental building blocks of the Internet of Things. These are tiny wireless chips that can be embedded inside clothes and objects and environments. And they're really ubiquitous. There's something like 2 billion of these chips, in use daily in the world. If you have a travel card in London, you have, an Oyster card, you have an RFID chip. If you have a library card or an access card, you have an RFID chip. So these things are, starting to cause a lot of hype and a lot of controversy. So that's, some of the things that Bruce talked about in Shaping Things, which I highly recommend that you read. So I think it's a significant technology because it is so ubiquitous. It's becoming, these things accompany us in our everyday lives. So for us, I don't think the Internet of Things is not a future scenario. It's actually something that we are actively working with, actively using and designing. So we're trying to build very kind of pragmatic and actionable research about how we design these things and how we use these things, what kind of user experiences they might create. So we're looking at the ways in which technology has been designed and the way in which it inhabits the world. So I'm going to go through a few different ways in which we can think about the design of user experiences with the Internet of Things, or with interaction that takes place outside of traditional contexts. So this is a nice image of, we've been collecting RFID objects from around the world over the last few years. And you know, these things are relatively common. You know, Oyster cards, tickets, access cards, entry cards, all sorts of things that now have RFID in them. And I think they're almost relatively mundane. You know, nobody sort of thinks twice about using an Oyster card. And I think it's quite interesting. Clay Shirky a few weeks ago said that, you know, technologies become socially interesting when they become technologically boring. And I think that's the case with RFID, is that it's, you know, it's become so entrenched in everyday life that it's not actually interesting technically anymore, but it's interesting to see what the cultural and social consequences of it might be. So we're kind of actively engaging with the technology, actively trying to look at how it works, how might we design it, and what can we do with it. The first thing that I'd like to talk about, the first kind of way of looking at these user experiences is to look at tangible interaction, the kind of the physical handling of objects. This is a media player that we designed called Bowl. It's just a wooden bowl that sits on the coffee table. When wooden objects are placed inside it, or when any objects are placed inside it, it plays back media. It's being used as a media player for kids, and it works extremely nicely. What we see happening in this case is that instead of media being a sort of passive consumption, media becomes a part of a play activity. It becomes part of the tangible manipulation of objects. It becomes a way to, it becomes a way to engage with both playful objects and playful media at the same time. In the same way, we've created an RFID reader for an iPhone. So this is very similar in that it's using an iPhone to play back media based on physical objects. So the iPhone has a this is just a conceptual video prototype. It doesn't actually work yet, but we've designed a system where the objects can be triggers for digital content. And again, it's about sort of trying to find playful uses of both objects and media, so digital content and physical objects, and to find a way that they relate to each other. I think this has quite interesting potential for advertising and entertainment. It's potentially quite a nice metaphor for interaction, that the physical object contains it doesn't actually contain the media, but it contains a link to media. Another project by us is a toy dog called Sniff. This is a dog that's designed as a companion in everyday life. It was actually designed as a tangible dog that can accompany children in everyday situations. It was actually designed to sort of increase the social cohesion between children of different abilities. So it was designed in collaboration with a blind association. And what we've discovered that through Sniff's physical objects, Sniff's RFID tags, he doesn't have a screen. He vibrates in different ways. He has a lot of haptic feedback, and he makes lots of different sounds. So he reacts in a scared way to certain objects, and he reacts in a kind of delighted way to other objects. And he sort of it's the process of discovery is part of the playfulness of the object. So it's been used as a way of having a physical object that can be used as exploration of an environment, and can be used equally well by kids who have difficulty seeing and kids who are able-bodied. So we see that this is quite a big trend. There's quite a lot of products and games and toys that are being released. This is the Brio network that uses physical objects as part of its interaction. So it's actually, instead of having a computer game or a screen, it has physical objects that have different actions when they're brought together. So this is RFID is being used as a very sort of mundane linking technology for creating physical games and physical experiences. But of course, there's a lot more to tangible interaction than just RFID. A lot of mobile phones, including the iPhone, now include accelerometers, so and GPS, and so they're starting to sense the world around them. This is a trend, I think, that is continuing to increase as the iPhone gets a compass, for instance. The objects that we carry with us are beginning to sense a lot more about the world than they previously did. Even fairly sort of simple games consoles now have microphones and accelerometers, so they're sensing things like sound and their direction. So the interaction with these things is becoming more physical and more tangible. This is a lovely project by Chris Webken at the Royal College of Art. It's just a simple digital compass connected to a vibrating box. And you wear the compass and you wear the box, and it vibrates whenever you point north. So he's experimenting with the way in which perhaps your senses could be aided by other things that we don't usually sense. So by wearing this box over a period of time, you gain a sort of an implicit, subtle awareness without actually knowing it of where north is, just by sort of rotating like this and feeling where the vibration is. So I think there's a lot of potential for tangible, physical and graspable and peripheral interfaces that don't require our full attention. Things like haptics and sound are very interesting for creating interfaces that don't require us to engage. They can give us extra kind of information without us engaging with them. So the next level of user experience with what we're calling an Internet of Things is connectedness. There's an enormous amount of new products that could only be described as having some kind of connectedness. The way that we can define these products is that they become useless if they don't have a network or power. So they become a doorstop without the connection. Things like the Nike Plus, many mobile phones, the Nabaz tag, the mirror, these kind of things. So Usman mentioned the Nike Plus, and I think Nike Plus is a really interesting example of a product that it doesn't function without having a connection. The connection to the internet, to the sharing, is an essential part of its experience. It's a physical product. It's high technology, but it's the way in which it works is very much about connecting and sharing. Matt Jones, who's a principal at Schultz and Webb that Bruce Sterling mentioned earlier, talks about alongside Tom Coates, talks about the idea of personal informatics, the idea that we might use data about ourselves and about our friends to really gain knowledge about ourselves and to become more self-reflexive about our everyday activities. The Watson is also a very good example of a product that requires a connection to function. It requires the internet to work properly. It monitors the amount of electricity that's being used in your house, and it requires you need to be able to go and share that data and compare that data to others to really make sense of it. Products like Tiki Tag, Toucher Tag, which are these kind of RFID peripherals that you can plug into your computer, they're designed to provide a sort of infrastructure for linking your physical objects to the online world, and to try and get your physical objects participating in internet interactions. And this is the Alinda radio that Bruce was kind of scared of earlier. It's a fantastic project by Schultz and Webb, where the hardware really mirrors the way that the internet works. So it's modular. It enables plugins, physical plugins. It has an API. It has a way of extending the functionality, and it connects to the web. And it in a physical way, it connects to the web. It shows you what your friends are listening to, and it gives you feedback about that. So it's a really fascinating sort of critical product that shows how physical products might mirror the way that the web works. Matt Jones again talks about the idea of thing-frastructure, the idea that every object radiates infrastructure. I think this is quite critical. That Bruce mentioned that researchers have been working for decades on how to sort of provide semantic resources for people to build this kind of Internet of Things. But actually, a top-down approach is not what's required. It's a bottom-up approach, a bit like the web, building interfaces, using services like Patch Bay, where we can build things from the bottom up and kind of provide our own little ways of plugging in, things being loosely joined. That same kind of model that has worked so well for the web can also work for physical products. So the third thing, the third aspect of the user experience of an Internet of Things is perhaps visualization and reflection. This is there's an enormous amount of data being produced by all of the things that we use every day, our laptops, our Oyster cards, and all of the products that we're talking about. So that, there's an enormous amount of data that needs to be somehow presented and reflected upon. This is a printout of my, a few weeks of usage of my London Oyster card. So you can get at this data. But I think this is one of the reasons why this idea of tracking and tracing is very controversial, because this data is somewhere. Someone is storing this data. Do I have access to it? How can I have control over it? Again, with the Nike Plus, it's when you plug the little thing, the dongle back into your computer, it sends your running data off to the web, and you get you start getting visualizations and feedback on your progress. And I think the data then flows out into the rest of the web, so the data then ends up on Twitter. The same thing with the Nokia Sports Tracker, that people are using their mobile phones to track their running progress or their cycling progress or their walking progress, and the data is being stored, and then the interface then provides a sort of a rich way of getting back into physical spaces and looking at what kind of things are going on in that spaces, what kind of training activities are people doing. And again, with the Watson that tracks your energy usage, they attempt to provide a kind of visualization interface. It's quite basic, but they attempt to provide a way of you reflecting on that data and you comparing that data to others. And I think probably more the really important thing to do there is to actually start using open services like Patch Bay, where you can actually start to integrate data from multiple sources and start to compare these things. So perhaps the richest, or one of the richest visualizations of data that I've seen is the work by the Sensible City people at MIT. This is a map of Graz in Austria, based on the sort of the density of mobile phones in different locations. So they've been tracking tens of thousands of mobile phones, looking at where they are, and seeing what sense they can make of that data. And I think it's very interesting to think about how we then take that data and bring it back into the interface. So if we take the sort of the aggregation of all of this data, where people are, what's going on, bring it back into the tangible interface, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So to start wrapping up, to go back to these three levels of user experience, I think we talked about the tangible and the embodied aspects of the interface. This is it's important to get this right from a design perspective, because this is how the data is generated. If the object doesn't get used, it doesn't generate data necessarily. So I mean, the data about us, the data about what we're doing, if these things are not used, they're not satisfying. I personally think that non-screen-based and glanceable interfaces are really important. I really like the idea that I can have objects that talk to me, or objects that use interactions that are not in the screen to give me subtle clues and things about and information about what's going on. I think that's an area that's really overlooked, and I would like to work more and for other people to work more with interfaces that don't require screen interaction. I think if we're going to inhabit the world with a lot of objects that are linked and connected, we don't want them all to be singing and dancing all the time. And here it's clearly important to have an industrial design perspective as well as an interaction design perspective. So the second level is about connectivity, and there has to be a reason for these objects to connect to each other or connect to the web or to actually share their data. I think this is often the breaking point with these kind of products, that they don't provide any kind of satisfying immediate feedback. They don't provide the baz tag gets used for a while, but it's sort of its connection doesn't have a kind of satisfying granularity to it. I think there needs to be a clear purpose for the reason why these objects are connecting to the network. And finally, the third level of visualization and reflection provides for an ongoing engagement with products. And I think this is interesting in terms of the longevity of our devices and the things we carry with us. That the more we see about them, the more we interact with them, the longer we might keep with these objects, and the greater affinity we might have with them. I think data visualization, sharing and comparison, these things are really important to get right. I think the possibility here is that we can have sort of a more self-reflection, more knowledge about the environment and the objects that we use. So I think these three things could be put into kind of feedback loops, and there's a kind of an immediate feedback loop, a short-term feedback loop, and a long-term loop of long-term use of these things. And I think that this is the model that we're now starting to use when we look at the design of a new product or the design of a new service. How do our products and services work at these three different levels? And I think we both begin to start seeing the way in which that we experience them, but also the way that we can design them. So that about wraps it up. And I think I'm quite happy to jump on an Internet of Things bandwagon, if it means that I don't have to use the screen as much as I do right now. I think having a greater interaction with physical objects that don't require us to be surrounded by glowing rectangles, I think that would be a good future. Thank you.